Greetings, IST 600 students. Welcome to week 10 of Web Content Strategy for Libraries. My name is Nina McHale and I'm your guest lecturer for this week. We're going to be talking about evaluating website content with Google Analytics. Let's go ahead and get started. So here's a look at our agenda for this week. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me first, and then we'll cover some reading materials for you. We'll talk also a little bit about Google Analytics. I'm working on the assumption that you're all starting from scratch here, so I apologize if that's not the case, but I promise we'll get into some more advanced stuff too if you're already passingly familiar with web analytics and web analytics strategies. We will cover the basic metrics, what Google Analytics, the software, can tell us, or the service rather, can tell us, and what it cannot. And then we'll look at converting website purpose into analytics goals. And what that means is looking at the primary and secondary goals of our websites in libraries and talking about why they exist and how we can use these sort of basic units of measurement, visits, bounce rate, all this kind of basic metric stuff we're going to talk about to measure that. And then to close, I'll have some suggested advanced concepts for further reading. So again, as I mentioned, my name is Nina McHale, and I just recently started, about 2 weeks ago, a brand new job as digital experience consultant at the Colorado State Library. Like Chris and Patrick, your other instructors, I live in sort of the greater Denver area, even though I got my double master's degrees from the Catholic University of America almost 12 years ago now. That seems like a long time now. So why am I doing this lecture for you? I've worked in libraries ever since I graduated, actually since before that, since 2001. Most of my experience is in academic libraries, but I do also have a year and a half in a public library setting. And while I started off in reference, I pretty quickly, about 2 years into my career, moved into and fell in love with the webs and with web and systems work. A colleague of mine, Tabitha Farney, who is a professor and the web librarian at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and I co-authored 2 books about web analytics, and we've done a couple of all-day trainings and different types of presentations on the topic. It's something that we're both very passionate about. So when Chris asked me to talk to you all about the topic, of course, I jumped at the chance. So here's your reading list for the week. I started off with 2 basic articles, both from Wikipedia, the one on web analytics and the one on Google Analytics. And this will just give you sort of a basic background of what the practice of web analytics is. Outside of libraries, it's very big business for commercial websites. And inside of libraries, it's something that we're still sort of exploring. Not all libraries collect and analyze web statistics the way they should quite yet. We've always analyzed things like books that were returned, gate counts, that kind of thing in the physical world, and it's just equally, and probably as we head into the future, more important to look at our web statistics across all of our websites and platforms and see how our users are interacting. So we'll start off with just that basic definition. And then with the second article, with the Google Analytics article, you'll just read a little bit about Google Analytics, the product. And then following that, I have 3 peer-reviewed articles. The first is Arndt and Wagner from the Journal of Web Librarianship, and the title is Beyond Description: Converting Website Usage Statistics into Concrete Site Improvement Ideas. And that's what we're going to look at today, is how do we turn all of these sort of numbers. This is a very sort of quantitative thing. You may have looked at qualitative issues like how to write for the web with Patrick and Chris before, but we're going to be looking at more of a quantitative side of things. So what Arndt and Wagner have done here is taken just these sort of sheer numbers and pulled them into these improvement ideas for their website. And also Journal of Web Librarianship, if web librarianship is something that you're interested in, if you think it's going to be a big part of your career, I highly recommend that you add it to your reading list. It's never that long. It's always very, very practical, and always packed with a lot of good information from our colleagues from the field. Mostly sort of as is the case, you'll find out with peer-reviewed articles in librarianship, a lot of it is focused on an academic setting, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't contribute your own stuff if you're working in a public library, or that you couldn't find something useful there. Next is an article by Tabby Farney. She's the person that I mentioned who we've co-authored books together about web analytics, and she wrote an article for information technology in libraries, called Click Analytics, Visualizing Website Use Data. And she has looked a lot into other software packages besides Google Analytics, which is why I've included this one. There are a lot of really neat things that you can see, you can use, there's software out there that'll give you sort of a graphical representation of where people's eye movements are on the screen, which is very helpful. So that's one thing that's of great interest to her. So she wrote that article in Information Technology in Libraries. Finally, Turner. This is sort of in the vein of the first article too, Website Statistics 2.0, using Google Analytics to measure library website effectiveness. And that appeared in Technical Services Quarterly in 2010. None of them really overly long reads. I hope that you find them interesting and practical. I've also given you this second reading list here, this reading list extras. This is if you really want to dig more into this. As I mentioned, web analytics is sort of a business level thing outside of libraries, so there's been a lot developed about it. So if it's something that you're interested in reading more about, finding more about, if you think it's something that your career as a librarian will be sort of intertwined with, here are some things that I would recommend. The sort of guru, the number one guru on web analytics in general, his name is Avinash Kaushik. He's not a librarian, but he writes in a very approachable style, and his sort of definitive, the sort of definitive first web analytics book was his Web Analytics An Hour a Day. He followed that up a couple years later with another title, Web Analytics 2.0, The Art of Online Accountability and Science of Customer Centricity. And you can tell by the title, again, it's a little bit more oriented towards the business world and towards e-commerce, but again, that doesn't mean there's not information in there that we can't take and put to work in libraries. Kate Merrick is a librarian, and she wrote Web Analytics in the Library. It's an ALA, American Library Association TechSource publication, so I'd highly recommend that. And in a bit of shameless self-promotion here, here are the two works that Tabby Farney, again, she's professor at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, two books that she and I authored. The first is called Web Analytics Strategies for Information Professionals, and that takes you through the whole process of picking a software product. We're going to be, again, talking mostly about Google Analytics today, but it takes you through the whole process of selecting all these different types of software programs out there that'll help you analyze the statistics and the traffic on your website. And then the second one we wrote was a library technology report, which is sort of a specific. Library technology reports are put out by LIDA, I think, which is the tech branch of ALA, and they often put out reports on one specific product or practice. So this one is very specifically looking at Google Analytics. It's called Maximizing Google Analytics 6 High Impact Practices. And this will cover topics. I have sort of a departing slide that I'll leave you with at the end of the lecture today that talks about the sort of things that we devote to chapters in that book, things that you can sort of graduate to once you've absorbed all of the initial basic concepts and metrics and goal setting that we're going to talk about today. As far as websites out there, I forgot to mention Avinash Kaushik has a website. It's called Occam's Razor, with a blog about web analytics, and there are a lot of really interesting reads and practical tips in there. If this is something that you're practicing a lot, I should add that. And then the Digital Analytics Association is a professional association. They're not associated in any way with libraries, but they one of the things that they've done, for example, is they've set up standard definitions for web analytics terminology. Google Analytics and all the other statistical sort of software and programs, they were all using sort of different lingo for these types of things. So the Digital Analytics Association, one of the things that they took upon themselves was to sort of normalize that vocabulary. And then finally, Google Analytics, the service, if you look at their documentation pages, and especially they have something it's called the Conversion University. Conversion is a goal. We'll be talking about that more in just a few minutes here. And they have a number of tutorials and a lot of just really helpful information. Google Analytics, it's something like a lot of the Google suite of products. It's free and it's pretty easy to use. So this slide is sort of the buyer beware slide that Tabby and I always include whenever we do presentations about web analytics. There are limitations and things and caveats, things that you should be aware of when you start using these products. Things like Google Analytics and other statistical analyzing software out there. Some of these include geographical location, and part of the issue here is that Google Analytics, and actually all analytics software, uses IP addresses as identifiers. So I could be sitting here in my house in suburban Denver, and my internet provider is Comcast. So if Comcast is in a different city or town, I'm still going to be reported as being in whatever city or city or town that Comcast is. So that can sort of limit the information or affect the information that you collect. For example, if you're a public library and you want to collect information, web statistics about people who are using your website, if everyone who lives in the area, especially let's say if you're in a more rural area, if everyone who lives in that area uses the same internet provider, it's all going to be showing as being from the same place. One other example of a problem that can be caused by this is the use of DHCP, and this is used often on campuses or in library networks. And if your network architecture uses DHCP, what that means is that no one has a permanent IP address. So you might be trying to separate web use. Let's say you want to run a report and see how do students use the website versus our library staff. And if you have, let's say you're on a campus, let's say if you have a computer lab, their computer lab IP addresses might all be mixed in with the same IP addresses as your staff. So you're not really, it's depending on your network architecture, it's hard to sort of separate those two things. And finally, that we don't get information, one of the things that we do not get from Google Analytics, and this is a good thing, as you'll see with the next bullet point here, we do not get information about specific individual users. You don't know that it's Nina McHale who is sitting on her couch at her house in suburban Denver doing this. We don't get a lot of, they're starting to look into that and making gender, age, that kind of information available, but for the most part it's not. And moving on to the next point, the reason why that's a good thing is privacy. As librarians, we are committed to ensuring privacy and keeping our patron data private. So while the IP problem, even though it's sort of a problem that we can't get the specific information about who's using the site where, it's actually a good thing because we really probably don't want to have all of that information. Especially, again, we as a profession are committed to protecting the privacy of our users. In any case, it's a good idea to have a policy about what data is being collected, sort of a, beware if you use our website, we're collecting this information about you, so that they understand what we intend to do with it. And what we do intend to do with it is for good. We intend to analyze their use patterns and how they use the website to make it better and make specific improvements. And so if you sort of sell it that way as part of your policy, then most people, I think, would see it as a good thing. And the third limitation or caveat here is that, as I've already mentioned, web analytics tools are designed for e-commerce sites and for business, and library sites tend to be different animals. One example I can think of for this is sites out on the web that want to sell you something, e-commerce sites. They want their sites to be sticky. That's a term that they use. They want you to stay in the site and keep clicking in the site until you reach some goal. And as we'll discuss a little bit later, the goal is called a conversion. So if it's an e-commerce site, the desired goal is that they want you to buy something. So they want you to stick around until you get to that goal. But library sites, we tend to be our sites tend to be more, we push people out. So if you think about a typical library website, you get to the homepage. Chances are, if you're looking for a book or if you're looking for a journal article, the first thing you're going to do is click on the catalog. And then in that case, if the catalog is in a separate domain, as is the case with 99% of libraries out there, then they've bounced off your site and they're not on your site anymore. They're in the catalog. Same thing with electronic databases. If you work in an academic setting and you have, hundreds of all these article databases that you want to push your users to, well, as soon as they click on one of those links, then they're off to EBSCO or Gale, JSTOR, any one of those providers. And I'll touch on that a little bit at the end. That's kind of an advanced topic, but there are strategies that you can use to get around that, to get sort of a fuller picture of how people are navigating through all of the different domains that comprise your library's web presence. So a couple more points to mention about limitations and caveats. I sort of got ahead of myself and described this already, but that's okay. As I mentioned, different tools will use different software, Google Analytics, AW Stats, all these different software options out there. Different analytics tools will use different terms for similar content or for similar concepts. And as I mentioned, the Digital Analytics Association is trying to come up with official non-proprietary definitions, and you'll see this on the it says more info slide, but I've since changed the title of that slide to advanced concepts. It's at the end there, so if that's something you're interested in, you can follow it there. But most importantly, and a lot of times when I'm teaching about analytics, a lot of people say, well, if we can't get this specific information about people, and if we have to worry about privacy, and if we're never really sure, exactly what we're tracking, that just feels kind of messy. Why bother anyway? But why bother is there's a lot of really rich information and a lot of really rich reports. I'll show you a couple samples. There's really a lot that we can get out of web analytics, and as you'll see in some of the examples that I have later, it doesn't just touch on the website. It touches on a lot of aspects of library service, much like the website does. Typically, before the advent of the web, you would have sort of your front end library people reference public services people, and then you would have tech services kind of working in the back end. And since then, web has kind of emerged, and it touches on people's jobs in a lot of ways that those other two areas do not. And for that reason, I think it's doubly important that we get as much information as we can, that we collect this quantitative data and make use of it, report out to our colleagues, report out to our administrators, and get what we can from it to improve not only the website, but our other services that we offer. So let's jump in and start talking a little bit about Google Analytics and how it works. Like most of the Google suite of tools and applications out there, it's free, mostly. It is not free if you have a lot of website traffic, and I have yet to meet a librarian whose website traffic crosses over into the paid version. As I mentioned already, it's sort of big business to have web analytics done on your site. It is something that you could hire a consultant to do, but if you can get through the lecture today and have sort of a basic understanding of the concepts and things that we're going to discuss here, then it is something that you can do on your own with a free tool like Google Analytics. There are other open source offerings out there. Google Analytics is what we call it operates via a JavaScript tag snippet. And what you have to do is you have to put a little line, it's only about a dozen lines of code, into your website, and then that will send the information about the traffic, about the people going to your website, where they're going, what they're doing, how long they're staying on your site, to a dashboard that you can log into with your Google account. But as I was saying, there are a number of other things out there too. About 10, 15, probably almost 20 years ago now, when the internet was sort of nascent, we didn't have access to this sort of technology, this JavaScript tagging method, and the types of software that were available then were more log file analyzers. And what a log file analyzer does is it sits on the website and it sort of takes note of everything that happens. It notes that, okay, this user's coming from here, they're using Safari on a MacBook, and they're getting to this content, and oh, they spent this much time on this page, and when they hit that page, there were 11 images on that page, so there were really 12 files. So it's just really highly detailed information. And one of the struggles If you read the Google Analytics Wikipedia article, this is sort of expressed there. One of the struggles was really trying to make sense of all that data. You can get a log file report for just one day that's hundreds of pages long because it just records all of these little minutia. And then one advantage that a product like Google Analytics has is that it converts that into usable reports, usable information. Most modern web CMSs, excuse me, like WordPress and Drupal, WordPress has multiple plugins. Drupal has a Google Analytics module that's very well supported that make inserting that tracking code a snap. If you have an older site, legacy site that's still not in something like WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, if it's a static HTML site, it can be harder to track information. It can be harder to track traffic on the site, and it might be easier to use one of these traditional log file analyzers like WebStats. But even if you can just get that tracking code from Google Analytics, even if you can just get that little snippet just on your library's homepage in one of those static HTML pages, that can make a huge difference. It can sort of get you to understand who's visiting the site, when, what's your popular content, how long are people staying on the site, that kind of thing. And if moving from a static website to something like WordPress or Drupal is something that's in the future, if you go and get a library job and you're handed a website and it's this 12-year-old site that's still in static HTML, they're still out there, trust me. I just inherited a bunch of them at my new job. Basically, what you can do is the method I mentioned where you install or have your systems people install a log file analyzer. But if you do plan on migrating to something like WordPress or Drupal, which I do highly recommend, again, if you inherit one of these sites at your first job, make sure that you have Google Analytics as sort of part of the package, is something that you want to include. And as I mentioned with most Google products, it's just very easy to use. You log in through a Gmail or your Google account, and there's a really easy to use dashboard. We'll look at a couple examples of reports on the next two slides. And it's honestly, it's a lot of fun. If you're in charge of websites, it's really neat to be able to go in and see, okay, what content do people like? Where are they coming from? How many people visit our site a day? How does that compare to, how many people come through the front gate in the library? And all of these things are sort of important to put together, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the bigger statistical picture of how your library gets used. And this, of course, is important because library administrators want to know when budget time comes around, they want to be able to show the impact of libraries. And as more and more services are being pushed online, things like ebooks, databases, journal, article databases have been around for a long time now. As we're spending lots of money and staff time on these things, it's important that we get sort of a baseline reading of how they're used. So if this is something that you find yourself doing, you will find yourself being visited by your library director who comes in and says, hey, we need to tell the board or we need to tell the regents how many hits we're getting on our website. So can you provide that information for me? So coming up with some of these custom reports and being able to, that's the other thing too, being able to sort of translate this information to them is very important. Okay, let's see. I think that's everything I wanted to say about Google Analytics. So let's have a look. We're going to have a look at the audience overview report and the traffic sources report from Google Analytics. So this report is, as I mentioned, the audience overview. And if you look down, it's kind of small print, but if you look down the left-hand side, you can get sort of a picture of the kinds of things that we can learn about through Google Analytics. This is the audience overview page. As I mentioned, you can see the little sort of jaggedy line shows the number of visits. And that top one kind of right in the middle peaks out at about 50. So what this is telling me, this is an analytics report from Colorado Libraries Journal. It's an online magazine that our state association puts together. And this shows, we get maybe 25 to 50 hits per day on a normal day. And so we know about how many people are visiting. And when you work in a library, you'll notice that there are often, this is a pretty irregular use pattern, it's kind of all over the place. But if you work in a public or an academic setting and you look at the web analytics for that setting, you're going to notice that there's a pattern. And in fact, if you can't see it on this slide because the graphic covers it up, but the sort of decoration that I added at the bottom of the slide here, that is a typical use pattern for an academic library. You have a lot of people in as we advance onto slides where the graphic does not cover this, you'll be able to see it. The low point is Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. This is a pretty typical pattern I found. Busy days at academic libraries. Fridays, people are starting to slack off, thinking about the weekend. Saturday and Sunday, pretty typically low, and then you can see that spike sort of going up again. So when you work in a library and you look at the web statistics, you'll notice that there are going to be sort of weekly trends, and that can, kind of depend on different situations. Maybe you have spikes when the library gets really busy. If you work in a public library and you're providing internet access for a lot of people and they're starting off at the library webpage. But anyway, this is just sort of scratching the surface. This is just sort of the hits. And that used to be sort of the currency of web statistics reporting. You could go to your library director and say, look at this, we got, 4 million hits this month. And if you remember websites 10, 15 years ago, it was sort of a badge of pride to have a little hit counter at the bottom of your website that said, you had 10,584 people visit your website. But again, that doesn't really tell you how people are engaging with content. It doesn't tell you, was that 10,584 different people, or was that 5,000 people who each came twice? You don't really get that sort of depth or granularity of information, which is, again, what we're going to look at here with Google Analytics. So if you look down the left-hand side, you can see we're looking at the overview. You can also get demographics information, where people are coming from. And again, remember the caveat that that's by IP. It's where the internet access point is coming from. You can look at technology, whether they're accessing it on a Mac or a Dell or an iPad or a Samsung phone. All of this type of information, mobile information, is reported. And visitor flow is something that's neat. It shows you where people are going within the site. So most people in a library's website will start off at the home page, and it'll tell you, well, from there 562 people went from there to this page, or 300 people went to the Get Help from a Librarian page. So it shows you how they're moving through all the different pages in your site. Going a little further down, you can see the other areas. We're looking again at the audience one, but you can see other reports that you can sort of expand. Our acquisition, that is where people are coming from. So which site or where were they out on the internet when they clicked on the link that brought them to their site? You can sort of guess what some of these would be. Like if you're in an academic library setting, maybe they clicked on a link from the college's or university's webpage to get there. Google Analytics also used to be able to tell you a little bit better. I think this is on the next slide, so hold on, I'll skip that. And behavior, you can see what content people are looking at. And then conversions we'll get to a little bit later. Those are goals. Think of it as like a conversion in, I guess, in football, or a goal in soccer, when you get people to where they want to go. And again, those are terms used a lot in e-commerce because often the goal is to get someone to buy something. But we have goals too for library websites. We have goals to, get people to the information they're looking for, to get people to a reference librarian chat window so they can talk to them. We have goals to get people to databases so that they can get reliable information, that kind of thing. So on this slide, this is a report from Google Analytics traffic sources, and they've changed the wording on this a little bit. This image is from a previous version of Google Analytics. That's one thing about them, but that's sort of typical with the speed of technology these days, is that they're always changing the product. So it's not called traffic sources anymore, it's called acquisition, as we saw on the last slide. But this will just give you an idea of the kinds of things that we can learn about. So you see the little pie chart with the green and the kind of orange and blue. The blue is representing direct traffic. That's someone who had a link to this resource. And I think this is a screenshot from Auraria Library at UC Denver, an academic library. So the blue, it's about 53% of traffic. People just came right to library.auraria.edu. They knew exactly where to go to the library's traffic, or to get to the library's website. The green, which represents about a quarter of all traffic, green means that something was referring them to the site. They were linked to maybe a link on the university's webpage, something like that. They were somewhere else out on the internet and they clicked on a link that got them there. Sort of an interesting side note, if you work for a library that has a lot of genealogical information, you'll find that a lot of your referring traffic comes from people doing genealogy resources. And they will get there oftentimes by using what's represented in the orange, about 21%, and that's search engines. And you can even see, and this is something that's changed too, I think it's not as effective anymore, but you can scroll down and see, you can, in that sort of table under the pie chart there, that's showing the keywords that people use to get to the site. So people were typing in Auraria Library, Auraria Campus Library, UC Denver Library. You can see how people think about your site or what words they're typing in to get there. Sometimes they might Google a staff or faculty member's name. It's really sort of surprising and informative to go and look and see how people ended up on your website. And then the moving over to the left, under top traffic sources, you can see sources. The first thing in that column is how many people came directly to the site, and again, that was 53%, that blue chunk in the chart. And then how many people came through Google, it was about 18%. How many people came from the next link is MSCD, that is Metropolitan State College of Denver. That's another college that uses the website there, so that's not surprising. We see UC Denver as a big referrer, 4,000 people coming from UC Denver site. And then the fifth one on the list here is Bing, another search engine. So you can really sort of get a flavor of how people are getting there, which is often pretty interesting and informative. And if you look back at the top too, you can see sort of the line under the visits tab. You can see that pattern that I was talking about. You can see every Monday through Thursday, the library is pretty heavily used. Tapers off a little bit on Thursday, and then Friday, no one wants to be there anymore. They want the weekend, and then Saturday and Sunday it kind of dips, and then you can see the spike back up. So that's sort of a typical weekly pattern. And again, your mileage may vary. If you go out into the library world and get a job, make sure you look and see what sort of that pattern is. It'll be pretty informative combined with how your library is used in the physical world too, to see how people are sort of interacting with the brick and click aspects of the services that you provide. So I mentioned hits before, that was used to be sort of the currency by which use of your website was measured. You could, tell all your friends that 20,000 people had come to your website, and isn't that impressive? And it's good to know that your site's getting used. It's good to know that it's getting a lot of traffic, but it's also good to know a lot more, as I mentioned, how people are interacting with your site. So here's some core concepts and metrics that we're going to look at here. We're going to talk about visits instead of hits. Visits became sort of the replacement for hits. And visits versus unique visits and page views. We'll talk more about what that means in just a sec here. There are two visitor types, new and returning. So you will know if someone coming to your site is there for the first time or if they're returning. And depending on the type of site you run, you might want a lot of returning traffic. If you are, sort of pushing a new marketing campaign, maybe you'd expect to see some new traffic, and that's how you could measure the success of that marketing campaign. User technology, I mentioned before, this is what type of computer or tablet or phone, whatever that person is using to get to your website. And then geographic data, I touched on this too. We can tell where people are coming from with that IP sort of limitation. Entry and exit pages, we can tell where someone entered the website. A lot of times with libraries, they're coming straight to the home page, but sometimes they might be linked to some other page. Maybe they're coming from Blackboard or course management software, and they're linking to a page that shows that displays a list of library databases about what they're researching about their topics. And then exit page is the last page in your site they're on before they click off out into the world. And exit pages are very useful for library websites because, as I mentioned before, library websites don't tend to be sticky, and that's what we want. We usually want to push people out to the catalog, to databases, out to other resources. So checking and making sure the exit pages are what we'd expect. Maybe it is that list of, business databases where people are leaving the site. That would be a good exit. And again, in e-commerce, a lot of times people who are looking at web statistics are more concerned about them leaving. They want to make sure that the exit page is, sort of a thank you for your purchase page, that kind of thing. So you can see if your conversion has been achieved, if your user has reached the goal that you've wanted them to, whether that's getting to, an EBSCO business database or buying a jacket or something like from the REI website or something like that. Referral sources. These are what we looked at before. It's where people are coming from, whether they're typing the name of your library in a search engine or linking from a college or university webpage. And then bounce rate is kind of a tricky one. A bounce rate is expressed as a percentage. I'll get more into this when we get down to the bounce rate slide. It's expressed as a percentage, and you want it to be low generally. I think Avinash Kaushik advocates for somewhere in the 25 to 40% range, but most of the libraries that I've worked in are more like in the 60 to 80% range. It's sort of a measure of success at how good your library is at keeping people there. And while library websites have gotten better in recent years, that's something that they're sort of notoriously bad at. You can tell your students or your public users to, go to the library website and use that. And if they don't find what they're looking for, a lot of college freshmen start their web search with Google and not the library's website. And it's because we have a higher bounce rate in part. We're not creating this sort of engaging experience as much as we could. And then we'll talk again. I've said the word engagement several times. We'll look at engagement metrics and what that means. So I know it's bad form to sort of read from slides, but since we're going to be talking about definitions for the next 10 or so, sorry, I'm going to read to you. We're going to be looking at, again, sort of some of these sort of official definitions. So visits are interactions on a website from an individual browser over a specified period of time. And as I've talked about, watch for typical patterns, that sort of typical college academic library use pattern at the bottom of the screen there. What does a normal day or a week look like for your library or for whatever organization or entity, the website you're developing? What are typical use patterns? When are people engaging with that content? I mentioned the Colorado Libraries Journal, which is hosted on a web page. And as you can imagine, every time we released a new issue, there would be a big spike of users because there would be sort of an announcement sent out statewide that, hey, look, we have the new issue. So you'd see a spike, and then a typical day, as we saw on that screen, is more like maybe 25 to 50 users. But there will be pretty typical patterns. Watch for heavy and light use days. And it's always interesting, I sort of touched on this before, to see, do your busy hours on the web match your busy hours in the physical library? If so, why? Why not? A lot of times people notice that there's an after dinner spike in the evenings, maybe people doing their homework. I worked on a commuter campus, so a lot of times we'd get people sort of doing homework sort of in the evening hours. And as I mentioned, you can think of visits as sort of there's the obvious analogy in a physical library to a gate count. Most libraries have security gates that not only protect people from stealing books and other materials from the library, but it also counts how many people go in. And you can see, as promised here, I'll elaborate on this metaphor a little bit in a sec here. So the next metric we want to look at is visitors. So the visitors are the individuals who come to your websites via a web browser. And as we've already touched on, remember, we don't collect any of that personally identifying information, and we try to keep, or Google Analytics and other web products try to keep that information as anonymous as possible. And again, if you think of the physical library analogy, people who activate a gate by passing through it, they are sort of one little click in the information gathering system for the gate saying, okay, one visitor, this woman walked through, she's one visitor. And well, what happens if she comes to the library in the morning and then she goes out to her biology class and then she comes back into the library? Does she still count as one visitor? Let's find out. So to answer that question as to whether or not she would count twice when someone comes back in the library, and of course you have people who don't use your library just once ever. A lot of times you have people coming back, if you think of sort of that physical analogy. That is answered by the next concept we're going to cover, which is unique visitors. Unique visitors are visitors who are counted only once, regardless of how many times they access your website in a specific period of time. And to determine this, again, web analytics tools are going to be using IP addresses. So sometimes what can happen here is if you have an IP address that lives within your library, it could be one student one day, it could be another student another day. It could be an IP address that's attached to a faculty member's computer one day. And that's that DHCP problem that I mentioned before. And also cookies are important too. And the reason for that is that the cookies help with the collection of information. on a visitor's computer, so the first time the person visits that site. So if you have a computer lab scenario, you're looking at the use of the website based on that workstation, and that could be, the 20 people who come in and use it a day. So that's another way in which that is sort of problematic. It will be seeing that computer, that IP address as a unique visitor, when in reality, maybe 50 students use that computer, or 50 users use that computer during the course of the day. So again, it's not a perfect metric. It's a little messy, but it's better than nothing, and it can still help us make a lot of important decisions. So if we go back to that gate count analogy, a person would be a unique visitor to a physical library if she were somehow tagged on the arrival when she came in. So in that image of the woman walking through the gates, if she were somehow, chipped or tagged or something like that, she would not be counted again when she came in the next day. But of course, we don't do that with physical gates in the library, but just to sort of use that physical analogy to further illustrate the concept. So a question that I get a lot doing training is, well, which should I use then? Should I use visitors or unique visitors? And the answer is, well, it depends. And it depends on what you're trying to measure and what you're trying to do with that data. So to give a couple examples here, if you use unique visitors, it will more than likely give you a more accurate view of how many people. So if you're asking a question that needs to be answered with information about specifically how many people are doing X on the website, then you should use unique visitors. If you use visitors, it will give you a higher count. And I have sort of an asterisk here and sort of a little winky comment at the bottom here. If you want that higher count, like let's say you're reporting to LibQual, which is an academic library survey program, or if you want to impress your library board, if you're in a public library, if you use visitors, it'll give you a higher count, and those numbers will be more impressive. And just to sort of further elaborate, I have another example at the bottom here. If you choose all visitors as a base metric for conversions, and again, we'll talk about that later, you'll get a more accurate picture of total website use. But again, if you're concerned about the success of individuals on given tasks, if you're looking at who is doing what and how, then unique visitors would be a better bet. And the reason you have to make this choice is that you'll see when we get to, this is something that's a little bit beyond the scope of an introductory lecture, but you can combine all of these different metrics. You can combine content, visitors, and see who's looking at what when. You can see who's been on the site for what's the average time on the site. Is it 2 minutes, 3 minutes, something like that? You can sort of combine all of these different things. So it's important to know whether you should use visitors or unique visitors. So the next metric to look at is page views. And I mentioned before that visits were sort of what replaced hits. Page views also are commonly referred to as hits, as someone has come to the website and the little counter at the bottom of my 10-15-year-old website advances one. But the page view is a number of times that visitors access a single web page or online document in your site. And Google Analytics will give you this detailed information for every page that's tracked. This is a little bit tricky, and this slide isn't entirely accurate anymore. It says more about what's tracked later. That's something that's beyond the scope of this lecture, so I apologize. That should have been taken off. But this is often the data that people who work outside of web services or information technology are looking for. They want to know what people are looking at, how many pages people are looking at. And if you've ever heard of the long tail concept, the long tail is in library websites, and if you don't know what the long tail means, that's okay, don't worry about it. It's still, the 3 bullet points here still make sense. The home page is almost always going to be the highest hit page in the website, and this is based on my like a decade of sort of what I've observed at libraries. And the next popular pages, pretty much in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th place, are going to be your library hours, databases and popular services, programming for public libraries, reference services for academic libraries, and there's pretty much a sharp drop after that. And this is important to know because if you're working on content strategy and if you're developing all this wonderful content for the web, you should know what people want to go to and where they're going to want to go. You're going to want to think long and hard about where to put those links to hours and databases. You're going to want to think about how you display information about services, that kind of thing. And we tend to put a lot of other information on library websites that really just doesn't get seen. So having a look at your page views, taking a hard look at that, will show you what people want out of your library website, and that can help you sort of allocate staff time and resources. A lot of times and this has happened to me several times, you inherit just a web page that's just gigantic and it has thousands and thousands of pages, and people get very sort of attached to the content that they've created. Well, if you could have spent a month working on this beautiful web page, but if only 2 people are seeing it a month, is it really worth the time and investment to maintain that content? Should it be part of the content strategy to include that? And that's something, I'll come back to this a little bit at the end. With your content strategy, that's something that you're going to want to spell out. That's how all of this fits, this web analytics stuff fits back into content strategy. It's primarily it's great value as an assessment tool. Okay, I got a little sidetracked there, but that's okay. Let's take a look at visitor type next, and that's new and returning. And actually, I'm realizing we already talked about a lot of this information, so I'll just go through this slide pretty quickly. As I mentioned, visitors are classified, again, by their association with an IP address as to whether they're new or returning, meaning, quite simply, whether or not they've been to your site before. And some people get sort of it's hard to think about, okay, when would I want to focus on the new, when would I want to focus on the returning? And neither of them is really more important or necessarily better than the other, but it's still useful for tracking trends. So for example, I have 2 little sub-bullet examples here. A high percentage of new visits indicates that a site is having a great deal of traffic driven to it, which is a positive. So maybe you just started a Facebook campaign or a social media campaign for your library, and you're throwing out links to people, and they're coming in. And then you'll be able to tell, if you go and you look at your refers, if you have a lot of people coming in through Facebook, you'll know that that works. A high rate of returning visitors can also be good because it could indicate that library users are loyal and frequently return to engage with web content, which is also desirable. And this is one thing that at my last job at a public library, we looked at how frequently people were accessing the site because we were refreshing the content several times a week. And then we realized that we really didn't need to do that, that was a lot of staff time and effort to put up new book covers, put up new book recommendations on the website when people really weren't coming all that often. So that's another thing to take a look at when you inherit a website, if this is something you'll be doing as part of your library career. Look at your new versus your returning numbers, just so you sort of have an idea of what's typical on, a standard day. And then if you have things like big marketing campaigns, or if you launch a new product, a new catalog, launch a new website, that kind of thing, those are the types of events that could sort of trigger changes in new and returning. Like with visitors and unique visitors, it's just important to be aware of what the difference is there. So the next concept we need to look at, we touched on this too, user technology information. And this is information that if you're a web developer, and also if you're just a content strategist too, there are a lot of jobs that are involving content strategy. It's important to know how people are getting to your content. So Google Analytics and most other web analytics softwares will report browser and operating system information. So what it will tell you is specific versions of browsers and operating systems that people are using to get to your site. It can tell you screen resolution, screen colors. That's very important to designers. They need to know how big to design things, and with responsive web design, that's gotten, sort of as a little aside, that's gotten very tricky. They can tell you if people have Flash or not. So that could inform your web team as to whether or not they wanted to have Flash content on the site. If not a lot of people have Flash, then maybe you want to think twice about that. It can also tell you, and I'm not sure if this is the case anymore, this is another one of the areas of Google Analytics that's changed recently. So it can tell you the service provider. So if you go and look at this information for your area, commonly it's going to be like, for here it would be Comcast, it would be whoever your big internet provider is. And sometimes it would provide a host name too, so you could see if someone was coming from, let's say if it's a library at Syracuse, they could be coming from within the Syracuse network. And this is an activity, if you have access to web statistics right now, I always like to have people do. Have a look at what your top 3 operating systems and browsers were 2 years ago versus now, and what do you notice? And I think most of you could probably guess the obvious answer there is that a lot more mobile traffic. And it's really funny because if you remember, again, 10, 15 years ago, most people were operating just on one sort of screen resolution. You could safely design, you could go and find out, not just on your library website, but in the world. Okay, everyone is using, this resolution for their screen, so that's how much space I have to design. But again, with responsive web design and mobile now, that's really sort of thrown a wrench into that sort of typical, here's my canvas, it's this many pixels by this many pixels approach. But again, just sort of an aside. Responsive web design is something that could be an entirely separate course. So I mentioned mobile, iPads, tablets, phones, smartphones. Mobile and analytics is still kind of complicated. There are a couple of reasons for that. And if you don't fully understand the why behind this, don't worry about it. It's just important to note that mobile is still sort of problematic in terms of web analytics. And part of the reason is because JavaScript support, and if you remember, we mentioned that Google Analytics operates based on that little snippet of JavaScript that you put into your web page. So mobile phone browsers, especially the early smartphones before iPhones had Safari and fully developed browsers on them, JavaScript was spotty. So if JavaScript is not available on the device, then the device is not going to get reported. And it wasn't until October 2009 that Google Analytics began providing mobile-specific metrics. And again, this is something that's interesting to go look at if you have access to analytics on a website, is what percent mobile are your users? And compare that again to, 2 years ago and see how it's increased. And the two metrics that Google Analytics provides are overview and device. So overview is just the number of visitors, the percentage of the whole that are using mobile. So it's just a simple yes, no. At least it was the last time I looked at it. And then device is just iPhone 5, Motorola, whatever model number, etc. And well, the fact that it just offers these two things may seem limited, and again, it might have changed now. I know they did another big release to Google Analytics. Again, you can combine these. So you could do a report, like let's say someone wanted to know what content are people looking at on mobile. You could run your page views and, or I'm sorry, not page views. You could run your content report against mobile, and you would get a good indication of what people do on mobile devices when they're on your website. And again, in bold at the bottom, it's still really sort of nascent tracking mobile analytics. Even the gurus like Avinash Kaushik don't really have a set approach yet. There are not industry-specific guidelines about measuring and analyzing it, but it's good to know that you have the option to do so, and you can kind of keep track of it. And it'll be interesting to see that's sort of a watch this area, pay attention as to how that might change in the coming year or two. So geographic data is reported through Google Analytics, and this is the kind of report that sort of blows everybody's mind. If you're ever having trouble sort of selling your colleagues on the idea once you're out working in a library, if you're having trouble selling your colleagues on the idea of web analytics, if you show them this, it'll blow their minds and they'll love it. Basically what it does is it presents, you can look at things on the continent, country, city level. It shows where people are coming from, and again with the limitations via IP. And it just looks, I should have included this as one of the sample reports. If you have access to it, go and look at it. We talked about why it's problematic, and you can sort of guess, getting down to the third point here, libraries tend to have a regional cluster around a campus or within the city or country. You can sort of guess that, if it's University of Colorado, Denver, most of the hits are going to be from Denver, surrounding areas, that kind of thing. But every once in a while you'll get sort of a weird sort of little outlier. If you are in an academic library, do you have a campus overseas, or do you have several campuses, different branch libraries? Are you sort of geographically dispersed? It's interesting to see what percentage of all of those branch libraries or all those disparate locations are coming from. Similarly, if you're in a public library, are there any interesting patterns across the area that you serve, across the county or the city? What does that information tell you? And a lot of times this is, again, it's what can really sell people on analytics data. I think I pretty much hit on everything we needed to know about entry and exit pages. But just to give you the quick official definition, entry, or sometimes called landing, pages and exit pages show how users move through the internet, arriving at and then departing to your site. So again, the entry, this is a pretty simple one, a pretty simple concept. The entry is the first page on your site that they come to, oftentimes the home page, and then exit is the last page that they're on before they bounce out of your site. I think I touched on all these before. A lot of times library websites are directories to other sources like the catalog or databases or ebooks. And while e-commerce sites might view it as a failure, it's not necessarily the case with us, which is why it can be really interesting to track what are the top exit pages on your site. If you're an academic library and you look and your top exit pages are all of the database listing pages, the pages where you list the business and the social sciences and the literature resources, that can be a good thing because that means we're getting them where they need to go. And just one sort of closing thought, we can gauge our success in directing our users to other library resources by tracking those. And that's, the more on this later, that's sort of an advanced concept that you could follow up with. It's on the sort of advanced concept closing slide at the end. So referral sources, I think we've pretty much covered this too. At the risk of repeating myself, I'll just give you the official definition. It shows how your visitors became your visitors by reporting the URLs of the sites they were on when they clicked to enter your sites. And we talked about these typical referrers for libraries are the library catalog, pages within the library catalog system. Something like if you use Evansed or scheduling software, if you have a lot of subscribed content from article databases, people could be getting back to the library page from that. And also parent institutions, if you're linked from your city or county's website, or if you're in an academic library at a college. And it's always just sort of interesting to see if you're currently working in a library, ask your web people, what are the top three referrers? And sometimes it can be surprising where people are coming from. Sometimes you might not have any idea why a referrer is on your referrer list. But again, those are the typical ones. Other licensed content and parent or associated institutions. So bounce rate, I mentioned before. This is, again, it's expressed as a percentage, and it's the percentage of visitors who bounced from or left your site after viewing only a single page or who stayed on your site for only a short period of time. And Avinash Kaushik has sort of a graphic but funny way of describing this. And his way of describing this is the user thinks, I came, I saw, I puked. They came to your website and it just was so awful, they just didn't even want to stay on it, so they left for something else. And a typical bounce rate you want to have is, or a good bounce rate rather, he purports is about 35%. But again, I have never seen a library less than, I want to say, 60%. And some reasons for this is because a lot of times we have in labs and common areas of libraries, we'll have the home pages set as the default in the web browser. So let's say you're working on an academic campus and you have a student who comes in, sits down at a computer, and they want to check their email. So they're probably going to bounce off of the library's website and go and check their email, whether it's Gmail or clicking on a link to or going over to their college website and clicking on an email link there. That's not a bad use of the computer, and we sort of set ourselves up for a higher bounce rate if we have all of those sort of home pages set as default. And again, with library websites, unlike e-commerce, we want to send our users out into the world. We want to send them out to databases, ebooks, electronic reserves, our catalog, that kind of thing. But if you can lower it by making some changes, that's typically a good thing. And again, if you have access to statistics for a website, check on your bounce rate. How has it changed in the past year? Have there been any major disruptions or changes to your web technology that would have influenced that? And if there has been something like that, can you think of reasons for the change? And with all of these, if you don't have access to a website with Google Analytics, don't worry about it. I just wanted to add something in case there are those of you who do have access to this or who have experienced this before. I just wanted to have sort of an extra little step that you could go and explore. Okay, are you exhausted yet? We've made it to our last concept here before we're going to start talking about goals and how we can put some of this information together. And the last concept is engagement metrics. And what these do is attempt to provide insight into how far users are delving into your site. So things like page per visit. And this is the number of pages in your site that someone looks at during a single visit. And the other thing is the visit duration, and this is the length of time, usually in minutes, typical, that a visitor spends on your site for a visit. And one thing about visit duration, I always felt at first that the visit duration was sort of depressingly low, like people were only on the site for a minute or two. But again, if you think of sort of the overall architecture of library websites, we're sending people to other resources. That's not that bad. And we don't, visit duration is something that might make more sense in the e-commerce world where you want people to stick around until they meet that conversion, that goal of buying something. But again, our aims are a little bit different, but it is something you'll see in some examples we have. It is something that can be very useful towards measuring and achieving goals on the website. And I do sort of just mention a final caveat here. These are very handy metrics, pages per visit and visit duration. But if you want to really talk about, if you want to really get some serious qualitative inquiry, again, with web analytics, we're dealing with quantitative inquiry. You should really do some usability testing with users. And you should just always kind of do that too. That's sort of the qualitative side of things. And again, we've been looking at quantitative. But if you really want to, these can show you the numbers and how long people are staying. But if you really want to find out what people think about the website, how they're moving through it, how they think about it, how they approach a task, such as finding a book or writing a research paper, you should really talk to them. And again, that's something that could be, hopefully is another class that you'll get to take while you're students at Syracuse. Okay, you made it through. We're finished talking about all the basic sort of analytics concepts, and now we're going to look at what we can do with these. And we're going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about goals. And don't be, I want to sort of interject at this point, if you're feeling overwhelmed, that's okay. Again, this is something that my colleague Tabby and I teach oftentimes in an 8-hour course over an entire day. So we've crammed a lot of information into this, and I've sort of reduced it into something that's sort of hopefully bite-sized for your course. Don't worry if you don't feel like you can't do this just yet. The further readings will get you there if that's something that you end up having to do. I just want you to have, my main purpose with the lectures, to have you have sort of a basic understanding of what software like Google Analytics can show us, and then how we can use that to turn it into very specific goals. So let's turn to that now. Goals in WA, Web Analytics, lingo. So goal, the sort of typical version of it is an anticipated result or objective, often used in planning and development. And those are key things. We're going to think again about how the website's purpose fits into the library as a whole, and planning and development for not just the website itself, but for other library services and resources that we provide. More specifically, used in web analytics parlance, it's called a conversion. And again, if you think of it as sort of the way conversion is used in football or goal in soccer, it's getting done what you want done. You've moved the ball where you want it, or the ball, you've scored a goal with the soccer ball. So just think of a conversion as a desired action on a site. What you want someone to be able to do, what you want someone to get to on your site. And we'll have some very specific examples of that here in the next couple of slides, so this will make sense for you. So conversions can be just about anything on a website. You can measure where people are going, how they get to where you want them to go. But a lot of times the tools that you'll use are going to focus on 4 things here. And that's, first of all, URL destination. You have some sort of target or end that you want them to get to, perhaps an exit page. This is the example of, again, I know I've said it like a dozen times already, but you get them to a list of databases, they find a good database, click on it, and exit. So that's a conversion. We've gotten them where we want them to go. If our mission is as a library is to provide reliable resources, we've helped them find it through the website. We know we've succeeded if our exit pages are those sort of referring pages where we're sending people out to ebooks, electronic reserves, catalogs, that kind of thing. Another one, or the second one rather, is the length of the stay, the visit duration. And pages per visit is the third. And that's a measure of site engagement. How much are they really getting into our website? And then finally, the fourth is an event, and that's a target action on the site. We're probably not going to get too much into that, but we're going to look again we're going to talk about primary and secondary purposes for the website. We're going to focus more on that sort of first scenario, the URL destination. The rest of those, it's again, I've put them here just so that you know what the common ones are. But we're going to be looking at, again, the purpose of the website and sort of tying this all back into all of these concepts back into the purpose of the website, how you can use these numbers to improve it, and then we'll sort of bring that back around to what that means for content strategy. So there are, for the purposes of this lecture, two kinds of conversions, macro and micro. So a macro conversion is going to, remember the word conversion always really threw me at first. Remember, that's just a goal. That's just something that you want someone to do, on your website. So a macro conversion is the primary purpose of the site. It's measuring why the site exists. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And a micro conversion measures secondary purposes of the site. And you'll notice here that there is primary purpose, singular. A macro conversion, there is going to be one primary purpose for your website. And it's very important to define that, and it's very important to get staff buy-in from all your colleagues in your institution when you're working on the website. And the micro conversion, we'll talk about this again, those are the sort of the secondary purposes of the site. Other things that are important, but not as important as the real reason that the site exists. So let's talk about finding a purpose. What is the purpose of a library's website? This is one that Tabby Forney drafted for the Kramer Family Library, which is the academic library at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And her primary purpose, the primary reason for her site to exist, is that she wants to have their users find the necessary information and resources quickly and efficiently. And that's pretty broad. And we'll have a look in a sec here about what some of the secondary things are. And coming up with this sort of purpose statement is very important. One of the most challenging things that I have dealt with over the past 10 years is coming up with goals and purpose and direction for a website. So a lot of times this coming up with these sort of definitions might feel sort of silly. Well, of course, that's why we have a website, so people can find stuff. But notice we've also added these adverbs, quickly and efficiently. That's the primary goal, is to get them to what they want to get to and then sort of send them on their way. And that sort of reflects what we do as librarians too. If you think of sort of a metaphor of reference, you're sitting at a reference desk or engaging with a patron in some other way, and you want to get them what they need and get them on their way quickly and efficiently. We don't want to waste the time of the user. Hopefully that's something that you've heard already in your library science courses. But anyway, let's talk about some secondary purposes too here. So secondary purposes are things on your website that are nice to have. So if the primary purpose is to get them, to the resource that they need or the service that they need and kind of send them on their way, secondary purposes are things that I love the way this is phrased here. It would be awesome if my users could, and then here are some examples. And you want to have only a handful of these secondary purposes. So some of the examples here for the Kramer Family Library are: find basic information about the library and library services. Remember I mentioned that library hours was routinely the second highest hit, the hours page, or however the hours information is displayed. It's almost always the second highest hit piece of information after the library web or the home page. It would be awesome if my users could connect with a reference librarian. Maybe you have a chat widget or something like that that you want to place on the website. And another one is library events and related library news. Events and programming will be very important if you're working in a public library. Programming is a way that we seek to market and bring people into the library. A lot of people still think that the mission of a public library is to provide books, but a lot of time that programming is educational and it's being used to sort of draw them in and see what we want. So that type of promotion of library events will be, this example is for the UCCS website, but it's very important in a public environment. It would be awesome if people could renew their books online. So these are some examples of secondary purposes here. It would be awesome if our users could do all of these things, but again, our primary sort of umbrella overarching purpose is getting them to the resources that they need quickly and efficiently. So let's look quickly at conversion rate. And again, I don't expect you to go out and be able to do this. I just want you to understand that this process is out there and exists. So again, if you're feeling a little unsure, just try to sort of absorb the concept here and know that this is a way that you can evaluate your web content. So a conversion rate is the desired action, what you want the person to do, whether it's reach a specific page. Again, it could be just about anything. If you think back on those examples that we saw before, maybe we want to get them to a page that has a link to reference librarian contact information or something like that. But it's that desired action divided by the total number of visits or unique visits. And again, remember, visits or unique visits, they mean sort of two different things. Unique visits tries to pull out the people who visited already. And I've just sort of put in, there's just sort of a notice that says most of the time the tool decides for you, so normally you don't have to worry about that. That's just sort of a good to know thing as to how the tool comes up with this number. So the important thing here, and again, if none of that made any sense to you, just remember that the conversion rates put desired actions in context. This provides us with a means, a way to measure what we want people to be able to do on the website. And it shows the percentage of how often this actually occurs. And you can use, there's another tool, it's sort of an advanced topic, again, beyond the scope of this, called goals and funnels. A funnel will show you where people sort of drop off. So let's say you have like sort of a desired path for someone to follow. I'll go back to that business database example again. Someone arrives on your homepage and they see a link that says, resources by subject, and then they click on that. And so we're following the percentage of how often that desired action, us pushing them down that trail, happens. So you can use the conversion rate as something, again, it makes things that previously, librarians were kind of guessing at. Well, we think they know how to get to these things. We think we do. It makes it measurable, it makes it accessible, and it can provide you with solid numbers for information for decision making, really, for decision making processes that can help you make your site better. So this slide, I've included this, it's sort of an aside, but I like it because I think it's useful for thinking about content strategy too. This is from George Duran's There's a Smart Way to Write Management's Goals and Objectives. So it's sort of beyond the scope of web stuff, but I think it's really helpful anytime you think of how to assess a project or a product. If you use sort of the SMART acronym, it's really helpful. So the S stands for specific, be clear and exact in what you want. And sometimes with web goals, it's really hard to sort of articulate that, which is why following this sort of rubric can be helpful. A goal should be measurable, set the benchmark. What analytics can you use of all those concepts that we covered, what analytics can you use? What numbers can you tease out to make that measurable? How do you set a benchmark for how many people get to this business databases page? And can you track, does it improve with time as you make adjustments to the library's web page? Goals should be achievable. And if you've been watching your website's performance for some time, you can be realistic. You know what your site's done. And generally, you're going to be measuring success in pretty small increments. We're going to look at some specific examples. If you can, increase something by like 3%, that's generally a good sign. Your work is done here. I'll have some more examples about that in just a sec here. The goals should be results-based. You need to know what the outcome, and it needs to be relevant and necessary to what we're trying to do, to, again, the reason why we're providing a library website. And it's something that needs to be timed. Do you want to track it for a month, see how it does, then make some changes, and then track it for another month? Do you want to time, or you can think of timed in terms of how long someone is on the site? Do you want to set a target time frame? In the example that we have here, do you want, coming up in the next couple of slides, do we want someone to be able to get to a resource in under a certain amount of, I think it's actually clicks instead of time, but you could also use time for that too. Because again, we want to get people in, we want to get people out quickly and efficiently. So on this slide, we're going to talk just briefly about key performance indicators. This is another sort of advanced topic that you can look into more. But I just wanted to include this again as sort of an example of how you can measure these things. And so let's say you've written up your goals for the library's websites and you've broken that down further into objectives. And we have here objective 1. And you can see how it relates back to, it would be a macro conversion because it's our primary goal. Connect a majority of our users that access the library's databases in a quick and efficient manner. So key performance indicators are what you use, numbers, metrics, statistics, what you use to ensure that you can measure what you want to measure, how you find out what you want to find out. So this KPI is written to determine whether or not we can connect the majority of users to the library's databases quickly and efficiently. And again, those adverbs are quick and efficient are very appropriate, or sorry, are very important. So let's say we write a key performance indicator. This is how we're going to tell if we're successful or not. So 60% more of our users or visitors to the site, to use the web analytics lingo, that accessed a library database did so in 3 or fewer clicks to the site. So we want to provide a simple, direct route to those databases, these resources that we spend, millions of dollars on to provide to our patrons, but that we have such a hard time sort of advertising. And so our second key performance indicator here, we want to be able to state and measure that over half of the visitors are able to find a library database in less than a minute from entering the site. So we're using clicks as a measurement here, and then we're also using an actual time measurement. We want them to be able to do it in less than a minute. So let's look at how we're going to do this. So let's look at that first KPI. And I love the title of the slide, The Power of Conversions. How are we going to check this information? How are we going to see if we can get 60% more of those users that access a library database to get there in 3 or fewer clicks on the site? One thing we haven't really had time to go into here, unfortunately, and again, this is something that's on the advanced topics, is called segmenting. And basically, just for the purposes of this slide, with segments, you can tell, in this case, we need to know, was it 3 clicks or less? That's sort of our efficient measure. Remember, quickly and efficiently were key when we wrote this KPI. If we can get there in 3 clicks or less, which we can tell by the advanced segment, and then the goal type, remember those 4 goal types we looked at, we want to get them to the URL destination, which could be, again, that list of business databases. So if we take the goal type, combine it with the advanced segment, then we have the answer. And then we will know if we have met that KPI, if we have met that goal. Okay, and let's look at our second KPI here. This is the power of conversions continued. If we look at the goal type again, and remember for this KPI we wanted to measure if over half the visitors are able to find the library, a library database in less than a minute from entering the site. So the goal type is still the URL destination. We want URL destination or event. We want to get them to that listing of business databases. And in this case, the advanced segment, and it says 3 clicks or less here, but I think that should be duration of visit. Remember, one of the basic metrics we looked at was how long someone is on a site. So if we look at the URL destination, and then if we look at the number of people who are able to get there in under a minute, then we have our answer for that KPI. So again, I apologize. Instead of for the advanced segment there, it should be less than a minute on the site rather than 3 clicks. Because remember, for that first KPI, we were measuring 3 clicks or less, and for this one, we're looking at time, less than a minute. So let's take a look at micro conversion, one of the secondary purposes. Remember, the macro conversions and the primary purposes dealt with the whole reason for our website's existence. And for most libraries, that's going to be to connect our users to those resources. So a secondary purpose could be to connect with a reference librarian. So we could write an objective to this goal to increase visitor use of online reference services. So maybe you have a chat widget or a reference email. And the key performance indicator 1 here is to increase the number of online chats by 10% in the fall 2012 semester. And our second key performance indicator to tell us whether we're successfully doing this, whether we're really connecting people with reference librarians more or not, is to increase the number of submitted email reference forms by 5% in the fall 2012 semester. And again, notice, as I mentioned before, you're not going to see a 50% jump in something usually. A 5% increase in something, a 10% is fantastic. It's amazing. You're going to be working in small increments, but with most web development and design, you really want to sort of tweak and iterate things rather than making big changes. And tracking down these numbers and sort of tracing the use and measuring, writing these goals, writing these objectives, and seeing if we're getting people to what we want to get them to is really what we're sort of focused on. So don't be disappointed if these percentages look small to you. That's actually pretty typical for this type of goal and objective. Okay. So as sort of a closing activity, or maybe a discussion starter, something you could work on amongst yourselves this week, I wanted to present you with these 5 real-life library web scenarios. And as I mentioned before, you'll notice that this is not only touching on just the website, it's touching on a lot of the other aspects of service that libraries provide. For example, look at number 1. Reference librarians want to know they're implementing a chat service, and so where should we put this? Where should we implement a chat reference widget on the site? We've got this little service that we're subscribing to. They provide us with some code that we put in on a website. Where should we do that? And one other sort of real life scenario that Web Analytics has helped out, or that I was able to help my reference librarian friends out with, was by looking at the traffic on the site, the sort of daily traffic pattern. We looked at those weekly traffic patterns. You can also look at them on an hourly basis. So we knew that the library website was busiest between about 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And as you look at these, I'm sort of giving away too much information here. As you look at these, I want you to go back through the lecture and look at those basic concepts and see which of those concepts would you put together to measure these. And if you want to take it to sort of an advanced level, if you've dealt with some of this stuff before, think about how you would write a goal. Think about your conversions. Think about what key performance indicators you would want to find these things out. But just on a simple level, if this is your first experience with web analytics, just read these over. Think about what of the concepts we've talked about would apply here. How would you find these things out? How would you be able to help your colleagues out in these scenarios? So the second one, this was something that happened in the public library that I worked in. The communications and marketing team wanted to know, is our Facebook presence successful? They'd put a lot of energy and effort into developing this sort of Facebook profile. So I want you to think about those basic concepts and think about how, with web statistics, you could tell your communications and marketing people, yes, it is getting people to our site. No, it's not. The third scenario, the library director comes, knocks on your door and says, hey, what are the busiest hours on our website? And it's part of a report that she's working on. And this is something that if web librarianship is in your future, being able to sort of talk the talk and report these numbers out to directors, to library boards, to the people who are making your budgetary decisions, that will be key for you. And I would if that's something you're interested in, if that's an area you're interested in, I would definitely recommend pursuing the sort of advanced topics and readings. So scenario number 4, your web developers want to know, okay, we've been tasked by management to develop a mobile app. Which platform should we support? So which of those concepts that we covered, how would you answer this question? If you had access to web statistics and knowing what you know now about this, how would you approach that problem? And then finally, let's say the web team, again, let's say these were all actual real life library scenarios that I've dealt with. The web team wants to know which pages on the site are the poorest performing and why. And the scenario that this is often presents itself is when you're getting ready to launch a new website or develop a new website. When you launch a website, everything is sort of clean and tidy, and then it'll sort of chug along for years, and more people will add more and more content, and you get to the point where you think, well, we have 3,000 web pages on this site. Do we really need all 3,000? And the answer is no, but you want to be able to sort of, with tact and deliberately be able to approach this problem and say, okay, this is what we're getting rid of and why. Because a lot of times people have put, if you have people outside of the web team, public services staff, reference librarians who are creating content for the web, they put a lot of time in that, and it's probably even something that is in their job description. So if you just go and tell them, oh, we're deleting all those pages that you wrote on European history, they're going to want to know why. And maybe the answer is not outright deleting the content. And this is where it's going to link back into content strategy too. Maybe the answer isn't deleting it, but coming up with a different way to promote it. The library homepage, the library website homepage, is one of the most hotly contested pieces of politics you will ever encounter in your library career, I can tell you from my experience. So if you have these numbers, and if you can report this information out, if you can work with your colleagues to come up with ways to sort of tease out what you want to find out, what are the goals of the site, how does writing information about European history help users find that information. If you can sort of repurpose that content and sort of put that repurposing back into your content strategy approach, especially when you're launching a new website, web analytics can be invaluable in that scenario. So sort of looping us back into the content strategy fold here. This lecture may have felt like sort of a departure from other topics that you've talked about, but really any content strategy that you write, any sort of product or document, and I know that's something that you're going to be working towards on your final project, you need to be able to measure and assess things. And you can do that very successfully, as we've seen here with web analytics software. And again, I've sort of already gone through this information with that last example, but when you're dealing with staff time, and whether it's just the web team or whether it's the people who create content outside of the web team, which is a pretty common sort of workflow. You have the web team who develops and maintains sort of the technology piece, but then you'll have a lot of people, reference librarians, subject specialists, especially in academic libraries, who are contributing that content back. You need to make sure that that content is adding value to the library's website, because if it's 25% of someone's time and it's not adding value, you need to either find a way for it to add value to the website, or you need to sort of reallocate that person's time. I'm sure you've been hearing in courses already that times have been tough for libraries in recent years, and you need to come up with objective, fair ways to assess all of this information. And that would be your job, if you're the web librarian, to provide these sort of these avenues, these methods for assessing, to be able to explain web analytics in a way that is clear to other people. Because again, if this is something, if they're contributing you content as part of their job, part of that needs to be assessing that content and making sure that it's making sense and that it's a good fit for the library website. So I would challenge you to bring some part of analytics assessment, and depending on what your final project is, it might not make sense, but I would challenge you to incorporate some of the concepts and some of the things that we've talked about here to sort of fold that back into your final project. So I've been mentioning throughout the sort of final advanced topics slide, and we finally arrived here. I would recommend, if going through all this has just really got you excited about this, that's fantastic. Here are things that I would recommend that you explore in the books and resources on that extras reading list. I would look at more about key performance indicators. We just sort of touched on that at the end. And again, this is something that's usually spread out over an 8-hour day of training. Segmenting and filtering is another important concept. Goals and funnels, I touched on briefly, how you can tell where people are getting to certain parts of the web page, if they're going via the path you would expect them or not. Event tracking, creating custom reports, and again, that's the scenario if you have someone, a director or management, coming to you and asking for numbers to support programs or resources or services that they would like to provide. A lot of times, again, it goes beyond the website. It touches actual services and projects and products outside of what is just in the web team's domain. And then finally, cross-domain tracking. This is something that's sort of fascinating and complicated, and the example that I give here is that your library's website and catalog are in different domains. Like, let's say your library's website is library.auraria.edu, and then your catalog is on a different server and it has a different name than with a .edu or .org domain. So how do you track that traffic that crosses back and forth? Because a lot of times people will go out to the catalog and then come back to the website, or out to a database and then come back and then search the catalog. So the way that you can do that is cross-domain tracking. It gets a little tricky. Tabby Farney and I devote an entire chapter in the library technology report that we wrote about that. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely pursue that there. So that is it from me. I hope this lecture on web analytics was useful. I've included my contact information here on the last slide. If you have any questions about anything in the lecture, please feel free to drop me a line. Or if I challenged you to include some element of web analytics in your final project, if that's something that I could help you out with by answering a couple quick questions for you or providing some guidance, please let me know. I maintain a blog and a website that deals a lot with library web topics at ninermac.net. So if this is an area that you really just want to sort of jump into career-wise, check that out. And you can also follow me on Twitter and on Facebook. My handle there is ninermac. Thanks so much for listening.